I'm very honored to have the job this morning of introducing this new series. Very excited about it and how it has come to be. We are exploring how to build a new base of collaboration at MIT and beyond, a place from which to convene a research community of leaders in education, leaders both at MIT, innovators at MIT, and innovators beyond MIT, new partners for us perhaps. This new conversation series will explore the key questions and ideas that we want to explore as a research community interested in systems change in education. So this is a kind of kickoff and a chance to dig a little deeper into why we want to do this and what's exciting about it. I want to thank our co-organizers, MIT Open Learning, MIT's Abdul, Latif, Jameel World Education Lab, J-WEL as we know it, and the Department of Comparative Media Studies and Writing at MIT School of the Humanities and Social Sciences, SHAS, CMSW in SHAS, and to acknowledge the generous support of the series from the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Stewart Foundation. My name is Diana Chapman Walsh. I'm a life member emerita of the MIT Corporation and a former member of its executive committee. I'm an emerita president of Wellesley College. I'm former chair of the board of the Broad Institute. I'm a former member of the board of Amherst College and the Mind and Life Institute and other nonprofits in education and health. You get the general picture. I'm out to pasture as emerita pretty much everywhere. I'm out here in Menlo Park. I have a courtesy appointment at Stanford, but I'm engaged still in several projects, the ones for which I have a special passion. The Council on the Uncertain Human Future is one. It has a global reach, but it's putting down roots here at MIT, which is exciting. You may or may not have heard of it. You'll find it mentioned on the climate portal. Another passion, a great passion, is this work on systems awareness. It's a topic I've been tracking for most of 3 decades with Peter and others, including Otto Scharmer in the early days and more recently with Peter and Mette. I'm a regular reviewer of the Master Practitioners Program in Compassionate Systems Awareness, which has been great fun for me. I'm a great admirer of the program. I've been through it and part of it and of the people that they've trained. And I expect several of them will be here with us this morning. I see systems awareness and systems change as central to MIT's aims in the world, in particular to the future of learning and the possibilities for robust collaboration efforts to advance a vision for a different kind of leadership is something I've thought a lot about, a more authentic, more connected, more compassionate leadership. And it could not come at a more critical time. I think we all can agree. Our topic for today is, what do we mean by systems change and why is it so difficult? And to kick off the series, we have 3 terrific speakers on that question, 3 real leaders in this initiative. I'll give their simple coordinates and then I'll ask them to speak a bit to us about who they really are. First, Eric Klopfer, known to all, I'm sure. He's head of the Department of Comparative Media Studies and Writing at SHAS. He's also at MIT, the professor and director of the Scheller Teacher Education Program and the Education Arcade. And he is a co-faculty director for MIT's J-WEL lab. He's a busy guy. Eric applies a design-based research methodology to span the educational technology ecosystem, from design and development of new technologies to implementation, and that includes, of course, professional development. Much of Eric's research is focused on computer games and simulations for building understandings of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. He pays particular attention to the affordances, I love that word, of new technologies, including AR, VR, and mobile, and how these can be applied today. Mette Miriam Boell. Mette is a biologist by training, specializing in the evolution of complex social systems, mammalian play behavior, and philosophy of nature, broadly trained, and she uses it beautifully. She has a Ph.D. in organizational ethology from the Center for Semiotics, Aarhus University, and holds additional degrees in contemplative leadership and the philosophy and history of science. Mette uses her training in these diverse areas to research how moods and feelings are transmitted in social relations and how the resulting relational fields in turn shape the larger systems that surround human beings. That pretty much says what we're all about. She pays particular attention to education. Mette is co-founder and director of the Center for Systems Awareness and is a visiting research science at J-WEL. And our third speaker, finally, Peter Senge, well known to all, I think, to the world. Peter's been at the forefront of organizational learning since publishing his classic text, The Fifth Discipline, in 1990, which provided theories and methods to foster aspiration, develop reflective conversation, and understand complexity in service of shaping learning-oriented organizational cultures. And that's what he's been all about. In 1997, Harvard Business Review named the learning organization as one of the seminal business ideas of the prior 75 years. Peter graduated from Stanford University with a BS in engineering. He holds an MS in social systems modeling and a Ph.D. in management from the MIT Sloan School of Management. In addition to that work, Peter has published several accompanying field books and titles like The Dance of Change, Schools That Learn, Presence, Human Purpose and the Field of the Future, and The Necessary Revolution. I'm proud to say I've read them all. They're great books. Peter is the co-founder and director of the Center for Systems Awareness and a senior lecturer at the MIT Institute of Technology. MIT, I'm reading something potted here and I don't need to tell you what MIT is. And he's also at J-WEL. He's focused on systems leadership in education. So these three remarkable and wonderful people were in for a treat today. So first of all, we're going to ask each of them to describe their work. We'll begin with Eric and then follow with Mette and finally with Peter in that order. And just they'll all speak a bit about how their own work relates to fostering systems awareness in education. So Eric, would you kick us off, please?
Thanks so much for that introduction, Diana. And I'm looking at the chat here and seeing all the different wonderful places coming up here, some of which I'd like to go to, some which I have been at, and a few of which I think are sort of will enter into my story that I tell right now of sort of my own journey through systems and into education over the years. And I'll give call outs to Ithaca, New York, Madison, Wisconsin, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, which will sort of play a role in these stories. I saw those in the chat. So I'm Eric Klopfer. I'm a professor, as Diana said, at MIT. I run our teacher education program and a group called Education Arcade. And I'm head of the Department of Comparative Media Studies and Writing. But rather than sort of telling you what I do now, let me tell you a little bit about how I got here, because I think that's really relevant to what goes on in systems and how I think about systems in education. So like Mette, I'm also a biologist by training. I think maybe it's some of the connection that we have between our work. I'm an ecologist by training. I did my undergraduate and graduate degrees in biology, in ecology, mostly in modeling of systems. So I did some experimental work, but most of my work was at the time, this was back in the 90s when computers were slow, but I did a lot of computer modeling of systems in ecology and evolution, and really found my passion was sort of in that systems work. Along the way there, when I was a graduate student, one of my committee members got also interested in my work and said, hey, would you be interested in using some of those simulations in my classes to help people learn about systems within my class? It was animal behavior. In fact, again, much related to Mette's work. And I said, oh, I'd love to do that. And started creating simulations for helping people understand different kinds of systems within the context of college classes. And then sort of just got really interested in that line of work and did that more so in going to work with K-12. And those simulations included things like that were on computers, but I did lots of things where people were sort of like modeling systems themselves, as you have a group of people interacting within a room, role playing, doing modeling of systems when they went out into the world to sort of interact with simple systems, and really found that's where my passion was. So I ended up graduating with my Ph.D. and went and taught high school and middle school. I taught computer science for a little bit, and then fortunately got a postdoc in education that was for folks who had done their degrees in science, math, and engineering who were interested in moving into education. And during that postdoc, I met Mitch Resnick, who's a very famous professor at the Media Lab. Many of you may know him. He's most famous these days for his invention of the Scratch programming language. but previously had invented another programming language called Starlogo, which was a platform for helping kids understand complex systems. So you would have kids interact with and model complex systems, anything from his famous book about turtles, termites, and traffic jams. So that's biological systems and social systems included, and really helping kids sort of understand systems in the world around them. But another part of that work was called participatory simulations. And so these were idea is that not only were you sort of observing simulations on a screen, but you could sort of participate inside of a simulation, enabled a little bit by sort of computation. So at the time it was these sort of wearable computers, and now it's a lot of mobile devices that we use to have people embedded within those systems. And a lot of that work is then sort of helping people sort of understand different perspectives on those systems. So one perspective is me as a member of that system. I play a role in that system. I impact that system, as an agent, as an individual within that. And then I also sort of like can zoom out and sort of look at what's happening at the systems level. Are other people, if other people are behaving like I am, how does the system evolve? If other people are behaving differently than I am, how does the system evolve? Looking at things at short time scales when I'm inside the system, and sort of longer time scales when I'm looking at it from outside the system. And one of the things we've learned is that sort of having those perspectives from inside the system and from sort of like outside the system are really important for understanding this. And so a lot of the work we've done over the years is helping people sort of get those different perspectives on systems by participating inside those systems, by building those systems, by observing those systems, by interacting with those systems. And some of that is on-screen immersive technologies. Some of it is lightweight technologies you might use when you're interacting with other people inside of a system on a phone. And sometimes it's without technology at all, where we're sort of just role-playing and understanding what goes on, and maybe using a computer afterwards to sort of analyze data or look at data or visualize data. So that's been a lot of the work that we've done. And along the way, we sort of learned, for a lot of the teachers that were involved in these workshops that we did, the perspectives that they would get in sort of teaching systems to their own students ultimately helped them understand their own world in different kinds of ways. So it wasn't just about how am I going to help them understand biology or chemistry or physics better through these systems, but I'm actually helping people and myself understand the world differently by understanding these systems. How I interact with other people. And I'd always say, we would do workshops for a week or two for teachers. And I'd always say, like, sometime around day 4 or 5, someone's going to come in, and then it's going to be a wave of people that are going to come in and say, like, last night I dreamt this, or last night I was walking down the street and I saw this. And it just sort of seeps into their lives in different ways and gives them a different lens on viewing the world, which is a really important way of viewing the world. And so over time, we sort of incorporated a lot more of that into our own workshops, helping people understand how, if they were trying to sort of change things in their own schools, they had to understand their school as a system, and be able to sort of think about who are the different participants in that system, and what are their connections with each other, and how are they going to work within those contexts. So ultimately, there were these different perspectives on the systems, which they were bringing into their own classes, and then sort of into their lives and into their professional lives as well as they moved around. So, and that, I think, over time, I knew about the work that Peter had done in systems, and sort of stayed on the periphery of that work for many years. And fortunately, in the last couple of years, had a much greater chance to sort of interact and come together and learn about the really great work that's going on inside of the Systems Awareness Group, and the impact that has on teachers, really around the world now. And I'm excited about this new initiative that we're launching to really try to think about ways that our work in our lab sort of intersects with the work that's going on here in systems awareness. So glad to be here today and see all of you folks. Oh, I didn't mention, I should have mentioned along the way. So Ithaca was where I did my undergraduate degree. Madison was where I did my graduate degree. And when I talked about that work with our initial work with complex systems, that was with Mitch in Santa Fe, New Mexico at the Santa Fe Institute. So those are my connections to those 3 places.
That's wonderful, Eric. Thanks so much. It's a great story. I love at day 4, they start dreaming and they realize this is an important way of doing the world. We do need different ways to be doing the world. We're doing the world in ways we shouldn't and wish we weren't. That's beautiful. I love the evolution of it. Thank you so much. Okay, Mette, you're next.
Thank you. Thanks, Diana. And thanks, Eric. That was just very evocative, and I look forward to the many, many conversations that are going to spin off of this. I want to just start out by saying thank you to everyone who showed up today. And Eric, Peter, and Lana, I won the bet So we made a bet about how many people would actually show up. As usually people register for an event, and we never know how many will actually end up actually being on the event. So I feel very good about this now. It's a wonderful outturn, and I see people that I haven't seen for a long time and many new faces, and it's just really exciting being here today. I have a particular kind of deep interest in understanding, coming to understand living systems better. And I've always had that. I started out studying complex social animals and trying to understand when they interact, what is actually going on, and how do we understand the context in which things are unfolding. And that's become a kind of a theme for everything that I've been trying to explore throughout these past decades of working very closely with first trying to understand complex social systems amongst non-human species, and now over the last more than a decade, really trying to study human beings as living systems and the types of spaces that we create and generate as living systems as well. And the reason why I'm kind of emphasizing this now is because my journey into education comes out of a kind of a deep grief or heartache of the state of the world. And I almost can't bear to think about the types of ancestors that we are, that we will be for the future generations if we continue on the path that we're on now. We're not in a good state, and we're not treating future generations to a state of the world that I feel that we're not being responsible and caring ancestors. That's a kind of a deep intrinsic motivation for everything I do. And we know that everywhere in the world, I mean, the mental health and well-being of children is declining everywhere. And we have there's huge pools of data that supports this. We see, of course, many of the people that we work from in BC, I see a couple of you here, British Columbia and Canada, who's been tracking the mental health and well-being over the last 20 years, very, very rigorously, probably the most rigorous in the world. And even though there has been numerous interventions, and it's probably the highest focus of social emotional learning in the world, the mental health and well-being of children is still declining. We saw a study that was published in Nature a couple of months ago, 10,000 young people from 10 different countries in the world, reflecting on their state of anxiety and depression due to climate change and the lack of adult action towards creating a safe future for them. So I'm naming all this now because that is really for me, the deepest motivation of working in education, because clearly when our kids are not thriving, we're not doing a good job with our education systems. And there has been a lot of initiatives, a lot of wonderful programs over the last 30 years or so, developments in social emotional learning and contemplative education, mindfulness in education, and so on, that have tried to kind of really address this in a very meaningful and sober way. The thing is, however, we're trying to apply these programs onto a structure that was never designed to have, to produce the types of outcomes that we're looking for. So the model of education that we have pretty much everywhere in the world, the actual system of education, is an ancient structure. And we think, because we don't really grow and cultivate systems awareness very broadly in people, we think that we should fix that system and then everything will be okay. And now we put on a program and it's going to fix the system. The thing is, however, structure shape behavior. So the structure that's in place is shaping exactly the behavioral outcomes that we see. So when we see mental health and well-being declining, depression, stress, anxiety, suicide rates plummeting, all of that, when we see all of that as outcomes for our young people in the world today, the very design, the very fabric of that system is flawed. So we need to redesign it. And part of that redesign needs to take into account that this is a living system. So I have two kind of really two rants that I would like to share with you, and I'll try to be short because obviously I can spend a long time on my favorite rants here. But one is that usually with all the work that we do, I'm heavily involved in working directly on the ground in various educational systems statewide and province-wide and so on in various places in the world with our compassionate systems framework. One of the things that people will I will hear so often is, how do you scale? And so here's my favorite rant. This is a living system. We would never talk about scaling our crops. We would never think about, how to scale anything in nature because it doesn't scale, it grows. And that kind of mechanistic approach that we have to how we work with systems from a kind of an organizational understanding does disservice to the potential outcomes that we can have of thinking about growth processes instead of scaling processes. Because the difference, of course, being you can't scale anything. There's some successful programmatic intervention happening over here in one pocket, and now you think you can do exactly all the same things and put it somewhere else in the world, and the same outcomes are going to come out. And it's never the case. Why? Well, because it's contextual. And living systems are not linear, and it doesn't produce linear outcomes. They are nested, they're layered, they're deeply interconnected, deeply interdependent, and there's a lot of intangible or immaterial processes going on all the time. Think about power dynamics or likability or friendliness that we have towards each other, or various ways in which we have biases or inequities in those relational systems that we operate in. If we are not taking all that into account in our attempt to try to understand how we can redesign a structure that produces outcomes of human flourishing, of young people who are reflective, caring, feel that they have a sense of purpose, meaningful existence, all those things that seems to be lacking so desperately now. We're really doing this service to the world. And the other kind of part of this is, well, what then do we mean by systems change? Because when we're thinking about systems in this mechanistic way, we cannot apply that to such a complex structure as a system of education. Think about who's involved in education. Well, clearly the students, and then the teachers and the principals, but they're the parents as well. Oh, and by the way, the parents are all throughout society, right? And then there's the district level leadership, the statewide level leadership, and everybody who's in between there. That's a vastly huge, complex, and very kind of, challenging to address just at one level. So we have to somehow understand ways in which we can become connected to the totality of the system in some way or other, in order for us to really, in a meaningful way, really create some of these, change processes. And how do we know it's working? Well, at least we should be able to find some indicators for what works and what doesn't work. And we haven't done a very good job of that because that lack of understanding that these are living systems, they're organic and growing systems. And that's what we could be looking for. How do we grow those change processes that will become self-sustaining over time, something that lasts? That's not just when, you have a wonderful programmatic intervention, somebody comes out and helps, trains teachers and principals and so on, and things are going really well. And usually it dissipates over time. And we would like for something that really becomes the very fabric of how we do school, how kids are thriving and flourishing and so on. And that's where that whole kind of contextual understanding, what we talk about as our social fields and how we shape generative social fields is deeply integrated in that. Has been my kind of deepest interest for decades. And the other part of this is, of course, the whole, the other question that I usually have a rant about is, okay, so what's your theory of change? Because clearly when we're working with an organic, growing, deeply interconnected and complex system, it's very hard to kind of map backwards how our theory of change should work, because what we usually do in those processes is we actually shut down possibilities. So how to work with much more dynamic models for change, allowing the stuff that will grow to actually become the outcomes, because we can't know. I mean, the metaphor, if we want to use the metaphor for natural living systems, you can plant a seed and you can prepare the soil and you can water it and you can make sure that there's sunshine and all of those things. But we can't really know what that tree is going to look like or what those plants are going to look like. They'll come up and they'll be uniquely their own. And so a lot of this work is really revolving around how we can begin to reconnect understanding that systems of education are living systems and we need to address them as such, so that we may begin to attend to the mental health and well-being of our children in our communities. And I mean, it's just delightful to be able to engage in conversation around these things. And I know that for many of you on this call, these will be conversations that we'll engage in over time also, to really just make sure this is not about, you know, one approach is the right approach. We have to be very creative and super eclectic and make sure that we do better service to future generations. So,
beautiful, Mette, thank you so much. You gave us a reason to care and a way to care and some things to rant about and lots of substance and lots of meaning. So thank you so much for that. Peter, your turn.
Well, first off, good evening, good midday, and for some of you, it's still good morning. I'm actually up here in northern Vermont, and I can report, you don't care about this at all, of course, but I can report that the temperature has gone up 30 degrees today from what it was yesterday, which means it's only like about -5 Celsius today. It was really cool. So I'm feeling great. I could be doing this session in shorts. And I guess that's a kind of a reflection on the fact that short-term changes catch our attention. And in many ways, it's one of the portals into pondering what the heck does this systems approach really mean? We live our lives in multiple timeframes. Just as the change in the weather today naturally matters to us, so too does the lives of our children and our grandchildren and even our great-grandchildren. As human beings, we live in a vast temporal landscape. And somehow, if we're going to create schools and institutions in general that are more conducive to us at our best, humans at our best, they too will have to embrace these multiple time landscapes. The plan for today is pretty simple. I'm going to say a few more words about the way we approach systems, and then we'll have a little conversation, and then there'll be a little time for you all to have a little conversation, and we'll have an open exchange at the end. And the reason for all that is we always do it to the best we can. Obviously, different media enable and constrain in different ways. Even in this wild Zoomverse that we're all gotten used to inhabiting, it really is possible to experience being together, thinking together, our different commitments. I mean, in some sense, all the ideas in the world here don't matter a whit. In the end, what are we committed to? What do each of us care about? Where does our heart lead us? So we'll do our best to create a little setting today where we can actually do some reflection together, as well as share some basic ideas. This is a particularly meaningful moment for me because I've been at MIT even longer than Eric, quite a bit longer actually. I came as a graduate student in 1970. I really always shudder to add up the years, so I'll just say the date and not even bother adding up the years. I had a mentor. I had a good fortune. I stayed for 10 years to work with a person named Jay Forrester. And Jay's quite significant in the history of technology. He led a team at MIT. This was actually just after World War II, that literally invented, prototyped, developed, and actually began to bring to a significant scale digital computation. IBM was their contractor. That's how IBM got in the computer business. And Jay, as often is the case with kind of people of that level of genius, after about 10 years, said, that's that. We've done something interesting, probably goes somewhere, probably will mean something. But he said, I really want to do something significant now. I always remember him telling me that. So we all knew this incredibly famous character. There is a floor of the Smithsonian History of Technology Museum devoted to Jay and his famous Whirlwind project. Before that, by the way, they invented radar. So he had this remarkable history as an inventor. And then he said, I think there's something much more important. He said, and he had this interesting phrase. He said, to me, this was him speaking, technology today is more like a production process. If you put enough bright people, enough money behind something, you'll get somewhere. But do we have anything like that level of confidence that if we put enough bright people and money to work, we'll solve climate change? Of course not. Do we put enough bright people and money to work, the extraordinary inequities in the world will be changed? He said all the big problems in the world have to do with the nature of our social systems and how they're working. And while we're sort of obsessed, that'll be my word, he wouldn't have used that word, we're sort of obsessed with technology, maybe the obsession is exactly one of the things that keeps us from giving our attention to what really matters. So the way we've approached this, all this work in education, I'll just say a few last words about that and then end, and then Diana can shepherd us along, is to recognize that the fundamental irony, or you might say paradox, of systems change is it's deeply personal. The system lives inside us. And of course, it lives outside of us. There are the artifacts, there are all the trappings of school systems, of curricula, teacher development, processes, and so on, et cetera. Yet, why are they the way they are? Because we think that's the way they ought to be. So the first thing that escapes most people when they think about systems change, the very word system tends to draw our attention outside to the things that are the manifestations, you might say, or the tangible embodiments of the system, and miss the fact that they're tangible manifestations of assumptions. Why do we measure what we measure? Why is the curriculum the way it is? And most importantly for education, why do we teach the way we do? Why is the classroom set up the way it is? These are not based on the laws of physics. They're based on the habits of human behavior. So when Jay made that shift, he kind of opened a big door, and he always said, you know, if we make any progress in this, it'll occur over 150 years. He just tended to naturally think long-term. He was a farmer in his history, so he had a very natural ability to kind of embrace these multiple time horizons. And it's very personal. In the end, all real systems change. In some sense, starts with us, each of us. So it's great to see you all, and it's wonderful to be part of this first new step for MIT in this broad systems universe.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's beautiful. I've heard you tell that story before, and it never ceases to send chills down my spine. It's quite beautiful. So maybe the obsession with technology is exactly what prevents us from seeing the reality of the fact that it's all within us. Let's see, something, I have some message on my screen I have to get rid of, sorry. So now we have some time to go deeper with these three people before we give everybody a chance to do some journaling and thinking about what they've heard. So we want to create a community of inquiry, a community of investigation. Peter and Mette, you've already created a community of mutual learning. I think we can say the systems awareness group, it's growing, it's remarkable. But there's this additional thing, which is how do we ask these questions? And the questions that Peter enumerated, why? The questions to which the laws of physics don't have answers. They're more about habits of the heart. How do we study that? What are we really looking for here? And what is it that MIT, we brought this into the bastion of technology in some ways. I was on the corporation for all these years. We always ranked first in most of the engineering disciplines in the world. MIT does. So why here, and what has to shift for us so that we can begin to develop answers that we can trust?
I think, if I may take a first pass at this, Diana, I think actually two things. Why at MIT? I'll come back to that. But I think what we're really in the kind of most simple, and sometimes the most simple is simple because it's closest to the truth. What we're really trying to do is to add care and kindness back into the equation, right? That there is a complete lack of understanding how, flourishing is human flourishing. If we want our young kids to thrive, if we want human beings to thrive and produce, societies that are equitable and just and create better outcomes with how we're addressing the world and so on, it's really a question about caring enough, which is why I think the compassionate systems framework is so is gaining such traction with folks, because there is a very direct and simple way to work with complexity and work with very, the big issues of the world, but adding care to that. So it's not just a kind of an intellectual exercise, but we allow ourselves to deeply engage with it and understand that we need that aspect of being human, of humanness, in order to actually thrive. I don't think it's rocket science, really. All of us who have families or have raised our kids, we know that if we didn't care deeply for them, the outcomes would be very poor. And why at MIT? Well, I'll say I as the total newbie to MIT compared to you, Diana, and Eric and Peter, I'll say I always loved that whenever I started kind of just hanging out when I was working with Peter before I had a position at MIT and all that, it was quite clear that there is a kind of a general sentiment that we're working to really create a better world. And I think this work in education, using education as a key leverage point, by far the longest time horizon, because we work with kids from they're very young. So the key leverage point for systems change comes through education. And what we're working to do is deeply, genuinely trying to improve what's not working in the world today, so that we might care about ourselves, care about our children, care about the climate, care about the planet, and all those things.
So I didn't mean to suggest that it was a puzzle why MIT was a good place to be doing it. I think MIT is a magnificent place to be doing it. I was sort of trying to push us to think about what kind of research do we imagine would come out of this? I mean, we're not going to randomize controlled trials. We're going to have to be very inventive, as creative and inventive in the design of research as you all have been in the design of interventions. And I'm wondering, Eric's whole story in a way has been that, right?
I'll say a couple of things, and then someone meant here, Catherine in the chat said something about awareness-based action learning, and I'll sort of add on to that sort of awareness-based action research. As in many of the ways we think about both sort of systems change and about research, it's not about sort of a top-down approach for that kind of thing, but really a much more sort of bottom-up organic approach, where sort of people have agency and understand their own sort of like localized systems better than sort of we can from afar. So I think some of the research needs to come from individuals sort of within that system. So we look to individual teachers, partners who are working with us to sort of be able to do sort of, I'll call it experiments in their own classrooms, be able to sort of think about how they change their system. Look at what am I looking for as change with, what am I looking for as feedback within my system to know that I'm being effective? What will tell me I'm doing a good, I'm making an effective change? What will tell me that I've not made an effective change? What kind of data do I want to collect? That can be, it can be about like the well-being of the kids in my class, and how am I going to know that? It can be about understanding of content or systems or interactions with the world. All different ways of thinking about how we gather that. And some of that is about I might interrogate my students and be able to sort of have dialogue with them to know that. I might be able to see artifacts of what they create to be able to know that they've succeeded in doing that. So I think that's really important in sort of being able to think about what I want to be the outcome and think about how I'm going to know that. And then be able to share that in a systematic way with other folks within the system, so that we all can learn from each other and start to sort of collect and find themes within each other's work. I want to quote, I mentioned Mitch Resnick once before. I'll quote him once again. He says, maybe he that was the one who came up with this one, but I give him credit for it anyway. And he says, we should be able to assess what we value rather than valuing what we assess. And that we want to make sure that we want to be able to think about what we want first, and then figure out how we're going to get any information on that, rather than sort of thinking about what's easy to collect and then sort of putting value on that.
I love that. That's great. And, interrogating my students, seeing what's happening, seeing what's different. What I'm holding in my mind is, if they dream at day 4, you've had an impact, right? So it's those kinds of really.
Absolutely. That's one of my big, if that doesn't happen, then I've done something wrong in that workshop.
Right.
If nobody dreams, systems dreams.
Right. It's a different kind of outcome. Peter.
Well, I was just thinking the fact that, the notion that mind is concentrated in the head and is basically is synonymous with intellect is a very Western notion. The oldest Chinese symbol for mind is actually a drawing of the heart. And the notion that our understanding is anchored, not just in our head, but in our heart and our gut, in our whole system, so to speak, is actually a very universal one, historically. So when Mette talks about care and compassion, I think that's another way to say it, is that the kind of understanding we're going to need to build. And I think Eric couldn't agree more with Eric. It's always going to be built from the concrete up. It's another way to say what Eric talked about. It's not top down. It's what actually happens, when human beings do something together, whether it's teachers and students, or teachers working together, or people trying to administer and manage these systems. It's, in some sense, it's the same process. It's how humans work together in a way that's not just based on their heads, but based on real relationships. You can't solve the problems of raising your kids by figuring it out. It's a lifelong discovery for all of us. You'll never figure it out because you can't understand it at some level, only intellectually. So I think that's a slightly different way to talk about the caring that Mette mentioned, that we really going to have let's just say, I'll just say in this case, kind of a heart-based understanding of the changes. And I don't mean that to mean sentimentality. I mean, there is a reason that in many, many cultures, this is seen as the essence of mind. It's not just the emotion. It's the fact that at some level, just like we can't understand many things without our hands, explain how you type, write it down in words, or how you drive your car, or how you do anything. The knowledge is in the whole system. And when we only operate from our intellect, we cut off our awareness of the rest.
Thank you. Thank you, all three. Mette, thank you for giving us caring to start us off too. It's the right place to start. So it's quarter of. We thought we'd break into small groups now and invite people to have smaller conversations. Our plan is to invite you to do some journaling for about 5 minutes, and then we'll move you into breakout groups of about 4 people per group. And you'll have 15 minutes in those breakout groups. And I will just set up some very simple guidelines. They'll be familiar, I think, to many of you. This is not a new technology for most of you. For those of you for whom it is, that's great. So first of all, for the journaling, we're about 5 minutes, and I'll keep an eye on the time. The question is, how do these themes and questions relate to my own work? My own work. So in Peter's terms, my own heart, my own total system. How do these themes and questions relate to my own work? And then when we move you into the breakout groups, I'll give you a protocol for that. But why don't you first concentrate on your journaling? So how do these themes and questions relate to my own work? And so about 5 minutes from now, I will break in and put us in our breakout groups. Thank you. Great. Welcome back, everybody. We'll take a little bit of time to debrief what happened in the breakout groups. And so I want to hear about how the check-in conversations went. And I'd love in particular to hear if there was a theme that emerged from within your group, a theme that you think the larger group would be interested in hearing, something that we might want to carry forward as we think about these questions in the future? So we have time for maybe 3 or 5 comments from groups, that somebody on behalf of your group who wants to be brave and bring a theme forward. Anybody? We're watching for hands to go up, whether they're little yellow ones or real fleshy ones. Lana will help me look. A brave soul who wants to take the plunge with a theme. Yes, Miles Fiedelman. Fidelman, I'm sorry.
Fidelman.
Fidelman, Miles Fidelman. Thank you, Miles.
Well, I'm just going to give you my basic reaction, which seems to be in agreement with, that what seems to be missing is the great sentiments, but what are the research questions? What's the agenda? What's the methodology? What are you actually going to be doing? And I guess the second comment was, I didn't hear an awareness of what other people are doing. There's a lot of other people working the same issues, and I think Edutopia in particular, but also I think Tom Malone's group, and something a little bit more substance, shall we say? Though maybe you were looking to us for some of those questions. I don't know. The other comment is, hopefully there will be some kind of follow-up to this in terms of an online community.
Sure. Yes, there will, and we'll keep going. I want to hear from groups too. Thank you, Miles. Happy to hear your questions. We can answer them. Don't worry. Themes that came up in any of the groups? Let's see. Yeah, Jeff Miller.
Multiple things we talked about in terms of power structures and communities that are more well off versus less well off. But I think one of the interesting things I've observed in the 20 plus years I've been engaged with various elements of this broader community is we've devoted a lot of effort effectively to developing curriculum and teaching methods for kids. But we haven't really, until recently, thought about what are the structures that the adults have created for them to be in, and how do we begin to change those perceptions? Because certainly here in the U.S., the history and the traditions of how schools are structured and built is baked in to everybody's psyche. And I've seen this in the school that my kids go to. When the school tries to do something that's a little different, parents get crazy because that's not school the way I know it. And they often confuse education and learning. And from my perspective, education has become, in the US for sure, a product of the industrial testing and textbook complex and less about learning.
Good point. Yeah. Thank you.
And just one final point.
Yep.
One of my doctoral students is on this call too, and we have been messing around for a little over a year now in talking about how do we redefine school and beginning to talk in more organic terms, like it's a learning ecosystem, teacher as gardener or facilitator or curator, rather than the old sage on the stage kind of idea. Right. That educators all have in their mind that this is how it's done.
Great, thank you. Jeff, where are you? Where are you teaching?
I'm in Indianapolis, and I have been a very involved parent with the International School of Indiana in that compassionate systems work.
Right, thank you. Michael Fullen.
Yeah, thank you. But there were only 2 in our group, myself and one other person, so we're not quite a group, I guess. But I wanted to say that the work we do is with a lot of schools, about 12 countries. We're based in Toronto, but we're reached out on it. We call it New Pedagogies for Deep Learning, but I want to cut to the chase by saying what's happened, and this is a good byproduct of COVID, is that teachers and students at the micro level are discovering that their best allies are each other, not the system, but other students, other teachers. And secondly, academic obsession, what I call the head domination, has been dislodged, and coming in also has been well-being and equity. So the agenda that people are wanting to work on now is actually quite potentially liberating from what was there in, let's say, December 2019. So it's going to take a lot to get it to happen, but we see actually scores of schools and subparts of schools wanting to do this, and we're enabling it. Still, it's a small scale, but it's not tiny. It's actually growing.
Because of the COVID emergency, in the sense that the world is just ruptured.
Yeah, because the old system, people knew it wasn't working, but now they really know it
There's no
wasn't working.
escaping it.
And the other things that come to the fore, well-being has forced its way in, but the positive side of well-being is compassion and all the things that we're working on. So there's a positive agenda here. And I want to say again, is that the students and teachers are finding, at least the ones we work with, that they are their best allies, each other and in other schools. It's not the hierarchy.
Great point. So Mary Conger, you've been waiting a while. Conger or Conger?
Conger, thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. A theme for us that I see looking back on our conversation, but wasn't a theme any of us really raised explicitly, was kind of back to what Peter was saying about how system change is personal, right? And each of us trying to, in some way, articulate and wrestle with a little bit how the work we have done in our own lives or are doing, or the things that are feeling transformative for us, how do we bring them into the systems, the structures that aren't already accommodating them? And so that's what I'm walking away with at the moment.
Question of how you can build systems that do accommodate people, individuals. Yeah, it's great question. Ellen Sparrow. Sparrow, did I say it right?
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
I mean, I think as expected, our group was mid-conversation when coming back into the main room, which I think is only just an indicator of the power of this group and how much we have in common. So I just wanted to also thank the organizers for this opportunity to get to speak with people who otherwise we probably wouldn't meet. And, I think one of the things that we really came across with is also the power in making connections between people in geographies and systems that are otherwise often disconnected. So we represented some folks from MIT and in the nonprofit sector, and what we call socially directed science and technology has a lot of these themes. Coming out of the K-12 system in Indigenous communities and working with refugees in the UK. And we really had a lot in common in thinking with our kind of mental models around the world. So I think that the theme that resonated is, thinking about long time and stewardship and relationship with the land. And also bringing in kind of the more industrial mental models, for lack of a better word, and finding a common ground between them that's productive.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you. Great points. You obviously had a good conversation, even though we cut you off in the middle of it. To
And
be
Pat-
continued. To be continued for years, I'm sure. Rebecca Obanu.
Yes,
Obunu, I said-
yes, hello.
Hello.
Yes, it's Obunu, and
Obunu.
I am part of the PKG Public Service Center at MIT, and our group was finishing. Like, I feel like we were really starting our reflection process, and we're just finishing sharing our reactions. So it's hard to necessarily share themes that were recurrent in our group, but I would like to share a bit about my personal reflection. I am of Haitian descent, and hearing Mette, Eric, and Peter speak, I reflected on how this is seeming to be a little bit closer to the indigenous knowledge systems and ways of teaching that I grew up with and I had when I lived in Haiti. And it also brought me back to a session that I participated held by the Global Council for Science and Environment, where they talked about the epistemicide of indigenous ways of knowing and intellectualism. So I think that it sounds like we're kind of moving closer to that. So should we also think about that too when we're asking questions about, well, what does research look like? And also, should we be even interrogating research as we know it in general? So these are things that have come up for me and questions. And I'll also say that I work with student social innovators across the Institute in the programming that I manage at the Public Service Center, and systems thinking is education that we have integrated into this programming and continue to look to do better at that.
Great. Great, thank you. It's great to have your personal perspective. It's great to have your MIT perspective and the PKG Center. That's terrific. Thank you for that. There is a lot of awareness of Indigenous practices, and many in the Master Practitioners Program. We have many people who've come through who are working with Indigenous peoples. We have time for one more, and it's Supriya Boellka. Did I say, how did I do on that?
Yes, you did well. You were my president when I was at Wellesley College.
Supriya, I thought your name was familiar, no wonder.
Patodia, I was Patodia there.
Ah, okay.
So I was so excited to see you here. So in our group, I think, we were starting to evolve on 3 themes that came by. That, A, what is the system we are talking about? How do we define the system? And I found it, so here I'm going to interweave my own personal reflection with my groups. So please bear with me. I found it very ironic that we are trying to change the K-12 system, and it's coming top down from MIT, from a university. But I think the system goes further, because what has happened is that the education now, as somebody said very correctly, there is becoming it's how we are defining learning and education. So again, it comes down, how do you define the system? What is the goal of the system? Because it's almost like a rat race. The parents want the children to go to the right preschool, to the right K-12, to the right university to get the right job. And when we start going for results versus learning, that's where all the problem starts. So can we define the system more tightly and maybe include the professional life? 2, we define, what is the change that we see should be done? How are we defining success? But there's, does it incorporate the compassion and the mental health? And the third is the assessment. So the 3 themes were system, empathy, compassion with the mental health, and the third was assessment. So system, we define that. I think we define what do we believe today is broken and what would the ideal goal be, and then go forward with that. I found it very interesting that we spoke about the Chinese symbol of the heart and what we say is joyful learning. And today, all the educators who are here today, they obviously care about the children and they are compassionate. So this is something you cannot teach someone. You have to be it. You have to practice it. It has to be in your DNA. And then you have a system. And if all the little parts which make up the schools, etc., they start following this from the heart, is when the system will not be broken, if that's how you define it. And the third part was the assessment, where, I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time, assessment was made for a reason, so that the teachers could assess better, right? But now we are making assessment to group people according to what we think. So maybe those are some of the things we need to think about to unbreak our system.
Good. Thank you. Okay. What I want to do now, we have just a little bit of time, maybe 5-6 more minutes. I'd like to ask each of our speakers to reflect on what they heard from these reports out from the groups, or anything else they'd like to say by way of wrapping things up. And then we'll say a bit about what's to come in the future. So why don't we, let's see, why don't we go backwards this time? So we went Eric, Mette, Peter. Why don't we go Peter, Mette, Eric this time? Peter, what did you hear and what would you like to raise up from this?
Peter, you should unmute before you start.
It's always good to unmute, yes.
Sorry, I'm in a place that got a little bit noisy for a minute.
Yeah.
Well, first off, I thought Miles is absolutely right. I would make the exact same critique. You know, what are the research questions here? And maybe I'll just pause on that for a second. I mean, we all have our kind of different answers for this, but in a sense, what we're trying to do is create a community that can hold the very diverse threads of deep change that are unfolding around education in the world and kind of jointly develop a sense of, well, what are the distinctive questions that we could focus on as a group at MIT? And the one other thing I think is really important, and I also appreciated, I think actually Miles said this also, there's no presumption here that we have the answer or this is an MIT-based initiative. It's really not. You heard a little bit from Michael Full, and Michael's a wonderful example of the extraordinary networks of change that exists already around the world. In fact, in many ways, the kind of inspiration for what we're doing is an idea that Senge Sharma, who's kind of our boss at MIT, he's the vice president of open learning and in different ways, very influential for all of us. Senge, I remember him saying, it was probably 5 years ago, there is a renaissance occurring in the world in primary and secondary education. I think if that weren't the case, we would be wasting our time. One small group is never going to produce the kind of change at the scale we care about. The key is that it is already unfolding in many different ways. So I think that's I really appreciated that point was brought out too, because otherwise this would be an exercise in kind of blind arrogance. And I don't think it would accomplish very much, but there is a lot of wonderful stuff going on. How do we more deeply understand the currents of these changes that are unfolding in so many different ways and in so many different contexts?
Thank you. Terrific, Peter. Okay. Mette.
Thanks, Diana. Thank you,
Yeah.
Peter. And thank you for all the great kind of comments, reflections, questions. Obviously, there's a lot that I would like to say regarding all of it, but I'm also mindful of the time constraints. So I do think that there is a kind of a common thread that I want to share. So Peter and I, along with a lot of the folks on this call, have had the great fortune over the last 10 years or so to work, collaborate on what we call compassionate systems change. And we've primarily focused on a community of practitioners. And a lot of our research friends and colleagues and so on have been, joining us in the work, as Diana shared, has been reviewing the projects of our master practitioners training and so on and so forth. Quite clearly, we are ready now for a community of researchers as well, not meaning that this should be exclusively for researchers, because one of the things that we're always really aspiring to is it has to be eclectic. As soon as we end up being like, my framework is the right framework, this is what will need to happen everywhere, we can tell that that's just not a good way to go about things, generally speaking. The diversity of various approaches and various ways of engaging with these big complex issues are really part of the solution. So it needs to be very eclectic. We would like to really be able to host a community that is more anchored in the deep research questions. That doesn't mean that we don't have ideas to what we would really like to explore. As I was sharing, this whole notion of context for me is vastly underdeveloped in our understanding, because we usually we study individuals, and we're used to studying what's going on in various individuals, but we don't know very well how to then understand what that context in which they're engaging is actually providing. Think about resilience, for example. It's been a big mystery in research for the last 25 years. Why do some kids grow up with immense adversity and yet they have resilience? And some kids seemingly have, pretty standard upbringing and they don't have resilience at all. And yes, we can point to, it seems as if the difference is if there is a deep caring connection to one or two educators, that seems to really do the trick. But we don't even know how to assess the quality of a relationship because we just haven't developed our literacy sufficiently in that domain. So I do think that there's a lot here, and we really honestly want to invite everyone in to just share your perspective and collectively think about this. Way too important for us to become kind of unilateral or claiming that we have the answers to all these things. Clearly we don't, but we know that something needs to change. And I'm just delighted that we've been able to start off today as we have. So thank you.
Great. Perfect. Thanks so much, Mette. Eric, you get the last word.
Okay. So some of the stuff I heard was things I hear often, which is, we see positive change and we're really excited about that. And at the same point, we're already seeing sort of the backlash against that to some extent. The parents who say, I didn't learn that way. The standards that sort of are regressive and sort of looking backwards to where we were rather than where we should be going. And the fact is that the world is a different place. Certainly, even when I grew up, we didn't have seminars with hundreds of people from around the world on a Thursday morning, as we just did right now, and have all this participation. The world is a vastly qualitatively different place, and we need to sort of be preparing people for that world. I think to some extent that's some of the exciting thing about, I think, MIT, we have a voice for helping to advocate for that change. And I think as we sort of create a more inclusive community to sort of understand how we can both think about that message and craft that message and expand that message with all of you is a really important part. But then also thinking about that, the fact is what I heard here was many different challenges in many different places. And so what we're thinking about in terms of deliverables from this effort is not sort of a prescription that you all need to fill and sort of execute at your locations, but really sort of thinking about principles and ideas that we can sort of work with and adapt to our local contexts, and think about how we can work as a community to sort of help those be meaningful in each individual place in which they are manifest. So I'm looking forward to continuing that conversation.
Thank you. Wonderful, Eric. So that's just great. And we're coming up on our time boundary. So we those of us who were organizing this watched the registrations come in. We were thrilled. It was a very high number. And then we were sort of taking a lottery, how many people will actually show up. At one point we had 200 people, which is terrific. And it didn't fall off very much. We thought it might fall off when we broke into groups, not very much. So we have a community already, and you are part of it. All of you who tuned in today. There will be, as you know, more of these. There will be 3 more of them. The next one on February 17th. You see the announcement here for it. It promises to be another really fascinating conversation. And then there will be a third one on March 17th and a fourth on April 21st. And we are gathering all of the comments in the chat. There's some really fascinating comments. I apologize to those I couldn't call on. After the breakouts, there were many more hands up than I was able to accommodate. Please save your thoughts, save your ideas, let them ferment and let them grow, and bring them back to us, because this is a big topic. I think one of the reasons that MIT is such a perfect place for this work is that there is at MIT a deep stance of humility. There's lots we don't know. There's lots we don't understand. We stand humble before the mysteries of the universe, and we try to move forward as best we can. So that's the way we're approaching this. So thank you, thank you. Great to have you, and see you again in February on the 17th. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
If you want to unmute, everybody can say goodbye. And whatever.
Great idea. That's a great idea.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
I love it.
Happy travels.
From all over the world. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
By the way, I have COVID and I didn't infect you. You can feel very happy.
Hope you are well.
Oh my God.
Yeah, be well, Diana.
Thank
you,
you.
Irina.
Well, thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Be well, all of
Thank
you.
you.
care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Kiitos. Greetings
Bye-bye.
from Finland and Spain.
Ah, thank you. Thank you.